Honors bands were a huge part of my life growing up as a musician. When I was in middle school and high school, I auditioned and got into the Olympic Conference Honors Band, the All-South Jersey Honors Band, the New Jersey All-State Honors Band, and the All-Eastern Honors Band. If I made YouTube content back in those days, half my videos would be about auditioning for the next honors band, and the other half would be preparing for my MAPS I&E solos. But now, as a music school graduate and a pro musician, I realize that the New Jersey All-State Percussion Auditions are kind of not good. I'm not a fan of what they make their percussionists do for the auditions. 6 years ago, I made this 3-part video series on how ridiculously hard the New Jersey Middle School Honors Band percussion auditions were. And since then, possibly because of those videos, there have been some changes made. Well, one change. They removed the ridiculously hard tambourine solo from the packet. Oh, thank goodness. Cause yeah, dude, this tambourine solo they made that 11-year-old kids play was more complicated than pretty much everything I've ever played. I mean, there's no orchestral excerpts that have thumb rolls, shake rolls, and knee fist techniques all jam-packed into one. In fact, the only thing that was harder than the middle school tambourine audition was the high school tambourine audition. Dude, this thing is so insanely difficult. Hardest thing I've ever played on tambourine, by far. And this audition also had the hardest thing I ever had to play on the concert bass drum and the triangle. I don't think that's the hardest thing I've played on cymbals. Some of these split parts I've written for videos are harder, but it's definitely the hardest thing I've done on concert percussion cymbals, though, that's for sure. In the great state of New Jersey, the percussion audition for honors bands is split up into 4 different auditions. You can audition for timpani, keyboard, snare drum, or traps, which is everything other than timpani, keyboard, or snare drum. So you only have to audition for one of these to get into the honors band, but there are some overachievers that like to audition for multiple sections in the percussion section, and I was one of those overachievers. Every year I would audition for both snare drum and traps, and I would always get a higher score on traps, so that's what I always ended up playing for the honors bands. Hashtag traps for life. Yeah, what's up? In addition to those 4 audition studies that you had to do for your traps audition, there was also a multi-percussion solo required, which was really confusing for me every single year as a little 15-year-old freshman trying to figure out what I'm doing. And there was also a traps sight reading, which usually was on a bunch of different percussion instruments, including the keyboard. I remember this one year, the sight reading, it had some cymbal stuff, and then it went over to some woodblock stuff for a little bit, and then we ended on the xylophone. And when I got to the xylophone part, I realized I didn't know where I put my xylophone mallets, so I just played on the xylophone with drumsticks, and it sounded like crap. So yeah, I totally bombed the sight reading in that audition, but I still got in because I was so good at those audition studies. I spent so many hours working on these audition studies. It's honestly pretty ridiculous to think about. The audition structure for a snare drum audition was pretty similar to traps. You had a solo you had to do, you had your sight reading, which was just on the snare drum for this, and there was also a list of rudiments. And by the way, I hate that you were allowed to choose whether to play a flam accent or Swiss Army triplet. for the sticking. Those are two completely different rudiments. Like, yeah, they have the same rhythm, but it's very different skill sets. It's weird that they didn't care which one you did if you got it. Since I auditioned back in circa 2001 to 2007, New Jersey has changed their percussion audition a little bit. They combined the snare and traps into one thing. They call it battery percussion now, which still requires you to do all the rudiments, the 4 audition studies, a sight reading, and you gotta do 2 solos. One is a snare solo and one is a keyboard solo for some reason. I mean, at that rate, why don't we just add a little timpani thing in there and call it a day? And that's the percussion audition. After doing some web surfing on every other state's honors band audition requirements, I realized that New Jersey is one of the only states that separates the percussion section into multiple auditions like that. And I really hate that because it's encouraging kids to just focus on one thing rather than, you know, become a well-rounded percussionist like every band director wants their percussion section to be. I mean, sure, you could audition for all 3 sections for the honors band audition, but that is a lot of stuff to prepare. You have to learn 4 entire solos, the rudiment sheet, the traps audition studies, all the scales and arpeggios. You have to do 3 separate sight readings, and also there are separate audition studies for the timpani and the keyboard. By the way, this keyboard audition study, it gives you the option to play on marimba, vibraphone, xylophone, or bells. But who in their right mind would play this thing on the bells? That would be the most obnoxious sounding thing ever. I mean, it could be a good way to troll the judges, though. It would take a really long time to learn all of that material, so it makes more sense, you know, from a strategic standpoint to just focus on one thing and get real good at that so you get into the honors band with the highest chair possible, which sucks. I hate it. Now, if I were completely in charge of making up the audition requirements for percussion, here's what I would do. First thing is I would get rid of all these dopey little audition studies. I think they're completely unnecessary. Honestly, I think they're only in there because there isn't enough audition material, since we're splitting the percussion section up into 3 different areas. But if you combine them all, this makes it too much material, so yeah, cut all that. I would still require 3 solos, a timpani solo, a snare drum solo, and a keyboard solo. However, you wouldn't have to learn the entire solo. It would just be like a small chunk of each one. The way they do it now is you have to learn the whole solo, and then when you get to the audition, that's when you find out what section of the solo you're gonna play, right? They're not gonna make every single audition you played the entire solo. That would take forever. So you might get lucky and they pick your favorite part of the solo that you're the best at, or you might be screwed and they pick the part that you totally stink at. You won't know until you get there. But I like my idea better, because everyone, you know exactly what you're doing and what to prepare. I'd also keep this rudiment list. I think it's good. However, I would separate flam, accents, and Swiss Army triplets into 2 separate rudiments, because they are 2 separate rudiments. That's silly. I would also keep all the scales and arpeggios. I think that's all fine. And there would also be 3 short separate sight readings on snare drum, keyboard, and timpani. So I would arrange it like this. There would be 3 different rooms that each percussion auditionee has to go into. One is snare drum, where you do your rudiments and your snare solo and your snare sight reading. Then you go into your keyboard room, where you do your keyboard solo, your scales, and your sight reading. And then you go into the timpani room, where you do your timpani solo and your timpani sight reading. And then all the scores from all 3 rooms are added up, and that is the percussion seating. This way is more like kind of like a mock college audition for percussionists, right? Because college and universities, they ask the percussionist to play snare solos, marimba solos, and timpani solos. I feel like a priority of these honors bands is to prepare the students for, you know, what's coming next in their musical careers if they continue on. And, you know, college auditions, that is likely the next step for most people. Now, I'm not saying it was a bad thing for me spending countless hours practicing triangle and tambourine and stuff, but Yeah, it would have been a more productive use of my time if I was working on, you know, how to tune timpani or four-mallet marimba technique instead. Because by the time I started preparing for college auditions, I was like pretty far behind in those areas, you know. My snare drum chops were really good, you know, I auditioned for snare every year, and I also did snare and tenors in marching band, so that helped. But none of this trap stuff is required for college auditions. Yeah, my bread and butter, it was completely useless for this. It's kind of funny to think about when I got into All Eastern Honors Band. Like, it's the best of the best from every single state. I think there were only like 5 percussionists selected, and I got in by being the best triangle player in New Jersey, while all the other kids that got in, they were the most well-rounded percussionists in their states. You know, sometimes you just gotta fake it till you make it, and it'll work out.